All right, welcome to the Unearthing Autism podcast. I'm Jay Beard.
And I'm Morgan Sumrall.
We're some self-diagnosed autistic folks in Orlando, Florida. And today's episode is how to tell if you're autistic. I'm going to introduce the topic. We're going to go into a lot of different autistic traits for how to tell if you're autistic, and we'll break them down into 5 large areas. And then lastly, we'll kind of touch on how to continue learning, to continue to explore if you're autistic or not. So this is actually our second attempt at doing the podcast. We didn't have the mics going on the first time. But since then, something has happened. I talked to my mom on Mother's Day, and she said that because from watching our podcast, she realizes that she's autistic.
Cool.
Yeah.
My mom has also been talking to me about that lately. She hasn't really listened to the podcast much yet, but she's also been coming to the realization.
Yeah. I think, my mom, she would always acknowledge that she had the traits that I mentioned, but she wasn't sure if that was really autism. And so I think our second episode, we go into the DSM, which is the medical criteria. And I think that really helped my mom realize that the traits are legit. And she could really relate to me with like the face blindness. So not being able to recognize people's faces, that's an autistic trait. And I always said that if starting this podcast just helps one person realize they're autistic, then it's worth it. And so we've already helped one person, and so I hope this episode can help a whole bunch of other people realize they're autistic. Yeah. So to introduce the topic, first I want to say that if you're trying to figure out if you're autistic, you can come to an answer definitively yes or no. It's not a wishy-washy thing. If you're autistic, you will have autistic traits. You'll have a full profile of autistic traits, not just one or two of them. It'll affect a little bit of everything. There's 5 different large categories of traits, and those areas are development, communication, sensory, movement/posture, and then a big other category. So these first 2 categories of development and communication are the kind of the most important 2 categories. So what's going on with autistic development? It's kind of like our genes are on a different schedule, so that we develop certain things faster and certain things are delayed, and we end up having pronounced strengths and weaknesses. So what are some common developmental differences with autistics?
Either speaking really early or speaking really late, or walking really early or walking really late, because it's usually like an extremes in development where you're either developing in a certain area really quickly compared to others, or you're developing there slower compared to others. And we'll usually have certain areas where we develop quicker and certain areas where we develop slower at the same time.
Yes, with autistic traits, a lot of the traits can go on either side of the extreme, like we said, speaking too early or speaking too late. And also, autistic traits are very different among different people. And a lot of them are quite rare, but you'll see an overall profile of autism when you explore all these different areas. So there's the areas you talked about. There's also being late to puberty, potty training. And autistic people end up often looking younger than their actual age.
You know what's so funny about this too is that since we recorded this episode the first time and we talked about this, I had a client at work who came in, and she was my client, and it was the first time I'd met her before, and so she thought that I was the receptionist at first. And whenever she realized I was going to be the one doing her hair, she was like, "How old are you?" And I told her I'm 26. And she's like, "I thought you were 18. I thought you were the receptionist." Yeah. I was like, that's so funny that we just talked about that.
Yeah, autistic people often look about 3 years younger. But sometimes there can be an autistic woman in her 40s that looks like she's in her 20s.
Mm-hmm. And my mom also is in her 40s and looks like she's in her 20s.
Yeah. My dad would be carded for alcohol when he was in his 50s. Mm-hmm. So it can be nice when you get older. But yeah, development is a good kind of objective measure of if you're autistic. with some of these traits, you might be saying, am I talking myself into this? Do I really have this? But with development, it's kind of an objective marker. Sometimes it can be a little hard to get hold of the information. When did I start speaking? But if you do have that kind of information, it can be a huge sign. So the other big area for autism is communication. So autistics are known for really blunt communication, being really honest, and one big sign is speaking too loud or too soft. So I speak too loud,
and I speak too soft.
Nice. Yeah, so that's a very big sign. Also, the DSM mentions differences in eye contact. So I make too much eye contact. And so I think there's a bit too much of a stereotype that autistics don't make eye contact, but it's more so that they feel a little uncomfortable with eye contact.
The eye contact is more forced than just naturally doing it. And also another thing that I heard somebody say recently was that it's kind of like, to explain to a neurotypical person what it's like is kind of like them blinking. Like if you imagine that blinking was not involuntary, and that we have to constantly every day think about blinking and blink on command, like we have to do it voluntarily, and that for autistic people, like masking is like that, and like controlling your eye contact is like that, where for most people it just happens naturally and they look in your eyes and they just do it like it's blinking. But then for us, it's like having to blink manually and constantly be thinking about that thing.
Yeah. I would say I have to kind of think about my eye contact. It doesn't come naturally, and I have to kind of think to look away. Another big one is one-sided conversations. So somebody that maybe they're not thinking so much about how the other person will take it in, and they go on and on talking about their favorite thing, and they talk someone's ear off. That's actually in the DSM. So the big two in communication, I would say, is the one-sided conversations and speaking too loud or too soft.
Kind of not picking up on those cues when your turn to talk is done and when somebody else is like ready to say their thing.
Yeah, and then the whole blunt honesty thing is like really, it seems really common, and so it's almost universal that autistics don't like small talk. Yeah. So the other area is, so those are the two most important areas. If you don't have autistic traits in those two areas, it's very likely you're not autistic, but usually autistics will have something in these two areas, and then there's a whole bunch of possible traits. So the next area is sensory differences. So autism can affect all five senses. So let's start with the sensitivity to light. One way I thought of explaining it is, I think neurotypical people, when they get hungover, they can have a sensitivity to light.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, it's kind of like that for us all the time. For me, not so strong. How would you describe it?
Yeah, definitely with like the outside light and like driving in like sunny or overcast sunny weather, especially overcast where it's just like bright white light shining down. And it's like a physical thing too, where it's not just like that it bothers me inside, like it literally makes my eyes water. It's like I'm crying while I'm driving, like wiping tears away.
It can be physically painful, and yeah, it makes you want to wear sunglasses. Then there's the sensitivity to sound, and I think this is pretty common. For me, this is really strong. I have really strong hearing, like I can hear quiet things that other people can't hear, something like the ticking of a clock. I can even hear my phone charging, like little electricity things. A common thing is not liking fireworks, not liking dogs barking, not liking lawnmowers, kind of grinding sounds.
I hated fireworks when I was a kid. I was so scared of them.
Yes.
Because I hated the loud noise.
Yes, speaking of being scared, this is sort of a sensory thing. Autistic people tend to have big amygdalas, the fear centers in the brain. So autistic people, especially when we're young, we get really scared. We get really jumpy from things. And even sometimes to the point of things like meltdowns and panic attacks Can you explain what like a meltdown or panic attack is?
So there's kind of like two different types with autism, where sometimes it will be shutdowns and sometimes it will be meltdowns, where meltdowns are more like outward and shutdowns are more inward. And for me, I have more shutdowns than meltdowns, where I will just like sometimes go nonverbal for long periods of time and maybe cry and have kind of a panic attack, maybe hyperventilate. That happens commonly. And then meltdowns are usually more like you might be like loudly crying or yelling or just being really outwardly upset and not having control over it.
Yes. I don't have these so much as an adult, but when I was a kid, now looking back, I can see that there was I was overstimulated. Something was too loud, and it made me kind of start hyperventilating. And so sometimes these traits are more obvious when you're younger. But actually, with a lot of these sensory sensitivities, they become more pronounced when you get older, I think. I know for me, the sound sensitivity wasn't so strong when I was younger, but it got stronger as I got older.
Yeah, I think the light sensitivity has gotten stronger as I've gotten older, too.
Yes. So food sensitivity, with taste sensitivity, we've talked about this in the first episode, that autistic people can have really restricted diets. We want to eat the same sort of things every day. And the classic stereotype is the chicken nugget kid that always just wanted to get fast food. Basically, me and Morgan.
That's me.
Yeah, me and Morgan were chicken nugget kids.
I'm still a chicken nugget kid.
Yeah, even to adulthood, like it gets easier over time.
Just had my chicken nugget fast food for lunch today.
Yes. But I'll say that maybe like half of autistics don't have this food sensitivity at all. Everyone else in my family will eat anything.
Yeah, and then there's also, with food sensitivities, there's also sensory seeking with food. So some chicken nugget kids might just want to eat chicken nuggets and have no sauce or anything, just the chicken nuggets, and that's all they want. They're sensitive to like the strong tastes, but then there's some of us like me where I'm sensory seeking with food, and so I like hot sauce with my food, so I always get buffalo sauce with my chicken nuggets, and I'm sensory seeking with the spicy foods, and I'm sensory seeking with the sour foods, so I really like salt and vinegar chips and sour gummy worms and Sour Patch Kids and things like that like get your taste senses going, and they're really stimulating.
Yes, and a lot of autistic people talk about sensitivity with the texture of food.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a wide range. Some people will just say that they're picky about texture. Some people will say that they'll eat anything. And then there's people like us where it's really kind of restricted.
Yeah, for me, it's like I'm sensory seeking with the tastes, but then I'm sensory avoiding with the textures.
Yes. So how would you describe the sensory sensitivity for smell?
For me, I'm really sensitive to smell, and if I smell a smell that I don't like, I cannot control myself from gagging. Like, I just start dry heaving if I smell something bad, and so it makes it really hard for me to do things like cleaning my cat's litter box and doing dirty dishes and taking out the trash, things where like you just can, it's hard to avoid smelling it, so I like cannot do it without like putting my shirt up like this and holding my breath, because otherwise I feel like I'm about to gag thinking about it right now.
Yes, I don't have it so much with the smelling. So your sensory sensitivities, it can be stronger in one area and not so much in another area. And then the sense of touch. So I cut all the tags off my shirts. That's a classic thing. And then I just dress for comfort most of the time because a lot of clothes are uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. A lot of autistic people don't like physical touch. Other ones very much do. Like, I'm someone that really loves massages. Other people completely avoid that kind of stuff.
Yeah, with the like tags and stuff, that's another thing where it's like avoiding and seeking, where you're avoiding with the tags, but then we're also really seeking, feel like how like Squishmallows and the feeling of soft, squishy things and things like that, or like we really like look for that and then avoid stuff that is like bothersome and itchy. And then with the massages, I also really enjoy massages, but I'm also extremely ticklish, like extremely. So I cannot even go get a pedicure, because the one time I did get a pedicure, I was just like, the only thing I could think about was not kicking the lady in the face the whole time. And I was just like, I'm never doing this again because it's way too much.
Yes. So another category is movement and posture. So an almost universal thing with autism is stimming or fidgeting. Can you describe what some fidgets and stims are?
Well, for me, rocking back and forth
Yes.
is my biggest one, because I'm like almost always rocking back and forth. If I'm not like walking, like anytime I'm just sitting, I'm usually rocking back and forth. And then let's see, I do a lot of things with my hands, and like I don't like the feeling of my finger being pushed up against my fingernail, so I'm always like pushing it back, and I like doing that like in a pattern like this. And that's a thing that I mentioned to my mom when I was in elementary school that I did. I was like, Mom, I can't stop doing this. I don't know why, and I don't know why I'm doing it, and I don't know why I can't stop doing it, but I just am always doing it. And she's like, I do that too, just like this. And she did the exact same one, and we never knew like why that was that we did it. We're just like, oh, that's, what a crazy coincidence. Wow.
Yes. So I do a lot of tapping with my hands, and I thought it was just drumming. Another big one is pacing. There can be vocal stems where you like to whistle or sing. One funny autistic trait is when you get excited, you like do some hand clapping. Yeah. A classic stim I see is just some sort of playing with the hands.
I heard it. I think it's called hand posturing too, like moving your hands in different ways. Like I kind of do that, like just moving my hand around, like feeling how far I can move in one direction and then go in the other direction, and it just feels really good. And then cracking knuckles. I'm always cracking my knuckles, even if there's no knuckle to crack. Like even if I've cracked them all, I still like the movement of it. So I still like do like that too, even like this one, and then I do this one.
Yes, it's a constant need, and some people especially like to do it to kind of calm down. And so there's a rare autistic trait, which is tiptoe walking, which I totally did. And I still kind of do to this day. So that's kind of like a big sign.
My dad walks on his tiptoes, and I walk pigeon-toed, so I walk on the sides of my feet, where when they say toe walking, most people think it's only on the toes, but what it really is referring to is not putting your weight on your heels. And so it's kind of a similar thing.
Yes. Yes, so those are the big four categories. The first two are the most important. Now there's a big category of other, and there's potentially tons of these, but some important ones are fixed interests. Oftentimes they're kind of niche interests. Sometimes I think more for the ADHD people, they kind of cycle between interests. But for someone like me, I've been obsessed with obsessions, basically. I've been obsessed with musical set theory, with Scriabin, and with economics. And so, just having these, like, really being fixated on certain things is a big sign.
Yeah. So with ADHD, you tend to have more hyperfixations, which are the short-term obsessions. And with autism, we have more long-term obsessions, which are more considered special interests. And so for me, having both ADHD and autism, I have a lot of both. So I have some special interests that have spanned over years and years and years of my life that I've never not been obsessed with that thing. And then there's some things that I get really into, like usually it's with like certain types of crafts, like making wire wrap jewelry. I got really into it for a while, and I got all the stuff to do it. And then like a couple weeks later, I was on to the next thing that I wanted to learn how to do.
Yes, and so actually ADHD itself is a kind of a huge sign of autism. Something like 60 to 80% of autistic people also have ADHD. So yeah, if you have ADHD, that's a major sign. There's tons of overlap between ADHD and autism. Also, autism kind of connected to a lot of conditions. Another big one it's very connected to is OCD. a lot of autistic people have some element of OCD. Yeah.
A lot of people, I think that with OCD and autism, like a lot of girls especially first get misdiagnosed with OCD, and then it turns out that it was just part of their autism that was appearing as OCD, because the outward appearance of OCD and the outward appearance of autism can look very similar, with like needing things to be a certain way or you're gonna flip out about it.
Yes. Yes, so another big trait with autism is routines and sameness. So I have a morning routine that I always stick to. I eat oatmeal every morning, and just wanting things to go the same way every day, wanting things to go according to expectation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I have where I just get really upset when the plan doesn't go as planned and the plan gets changed. It makes me feel really, really uneasy and uncomfortable and panicky if a plan gets canceled or changed. And so for me, it's hard to keep a routine or hard to make a routine that I'm like dedicated to, because I know that when and if that routine gets messed up and it has to change, then I know I'm gonna feel uncomfortable. So I try to plan to just go with the flow of things. But then there's some routines that I do get into where I just really, really enjoy it. Like recently, and this is also since we recorded the other episode, I got a bunch of new skincare products and stuff, and I got like a little headband to put on when I do my skincare. And so I've been doing it like every morning and night. And like I was with my boyfriend and we were gonna go to bed, and I was like, oh, I gotta go do my skincare. And he's like, oh, you like having your little routine? And I was like, I love it.
Yes.
It feels so good.
Yes, routines are great. Sometimes the ADHD folks, they'll say, oh, I really benefit from routines, but I can't get myself to do it. While the autistic people, more on that side, they really naturally fall into it.
Yeah, that's a thing where like I feel like my autism side and ADHD side are often like kind of competing. And so it's like, because I know that the autism is going to get really upset if the ADHD messes up the plans, then like let's just not even make a plan, because we know ADHD me is going to screw it all up.
Yes, another sign is being very moral and having a sense for justice. I even sometimes call it moral OCD, like being really kind of picky. Like if you're supposed to split a meal with someone, you don't want to let them pay a few extra cents. You're kind of rigid about morality. Mm-hmm. And it's autistic people are known for not lying. And there's actually been studies on children, and that children with autism are much less likely to lie.
Yeah, and a really good image for the like strong sense of justice, and that often appears really strongly in girls, is Greta Thunberg, because she's autistic and she just has like the biggest sense of justice and like and being an activist, and that's really common too. Yes.
Another sign of autism is or possible profile in autism is being really artistic. So I'm really into music, and some people with autism are very gifted with art. Something like 10% of autistics have savant syndrome, which means that their brain is really connected and that they're incredibly skilled in an area like art, music, mathematics, something like that. I've noticed that just about every autistic person I've ever met can sing, and autistic people tend to like to sing. Some of them are into painting, as I mentioned. Some of them are into writing. But yeah, not all autistic people are crazy good in these areas, but they tend to be interested or like the arts.
Yeah.
Another one that doesn't get talked about much is temperature dysregulation. I do really bad in the cold, but I know it can go both ways. How are you with temperature?
Yeah, I do really bad when it's an extreme of either one. Like if it's too hot or too cold, either one I don't like, but I prefer it being a little colder, because then I feel like I have more control over my own temperature, because I can always keep putting more layers on. But when it's hot, there's only so many clothes you can take off.
Yes.
So I like being cozy. I really like being like cozy covered with squishy blankets and pillows, and so yeah, that's what
autistic people sometimes like weighted blankets, and for me, I can feel every bit of air from like a fan hitting me, and I just don't do well with the cold. It can even bring about a shutdown. Another trait is anxiety and depression. So I don't have anxiety and depression. You explain it to us, Morgan.
And I definitely have anxiety and depression. I've always been a really anxious person, an anxious child, and that's always just been like basically part of my personality. As long as I can remember, I've been really anxious. And then depression, I think just when you are somebody who is going most of your life, up to this point at least, undiagnosed, and you know that there's something wrong with you and that you're different, but you don't really know what it is, and you feel like you're just not the right kind of person to be in this world, and this world isn't like made for you to thrive. It makes it really hard to just like be a person and live in society, and that's like kind of inevitable to get depression when you're going through those things.
Yes, I think I read like 65% of diagnosed autistics have anxiety and or depression. It seems to be one of the most debilitating parts of being autistic. And so, yeah, it's quite common. So kind of related to that is emotions. So this is a funny one where it can be quite different between men and women. So for me, I'm a little bit disconnected from emotions. It's very hard for me to cry. In fact, I basically can't cry unless there's music going on. Like music helps me with the whole emotional regulation thing. But yeah, in general, there's a bit of a disconnect. And with women, it can be quite the opposite.
Yep, it's the complete opposite for me. I'm extremely emotional, and I cry every single day.
And when you see someone cry...
And yeah, if I see somebody cry, I can't not cry. I cry every time I see somebody else crying.
Yeah, so...
And that's another thing with like the empathy thing too, is that there's different types of empathy. There's emotional empathy and intellectual empathy, where autistic people usually kind of have one or the other, where it's not that we don't have empathy, it's just that we feel it and show it in different ways. So some of us like will only, get upset if we are seeing another person actually be upset, where if somebody's telling us if somebody's telling me a really sad situation, I probably am not going to cry, and I can't even force myself to cry. But if I see somebody telling me that situation and they are obviously upset about it and they are crying about it, then I immediately cry. So, and then there's like the other type of empathy where it's more like kind of the opposite of that, where like you can only cry if you're like really thinking about the situation, but seeing somebody else cry, you don't feel that at all.
Yeah, so I can be interpreted as lacking empathy sometimes, although I definitely do have empathy. But basically, there's this stereotype that autistic people don't have empathy. And in fact, maybe half of autistic people have very, very high levels of empathy. Another autistic trait is having bad short-term memory and having great long-term memory. So maybe somebody, they tell you their name and 5 seconds later you forget it, but you can remember some great details about your childhood.
Yeah, and I have kind of bad memory for both of those, and I think it's because trauma has affected my long-term memory, and then my short-term memory is just all over the place.
Yeah, we should mention trauma. I've heard the phrase, there's no such thing as an untraumatized autistic.
Yeah, I recently just heard somebody talking about that like just being autistic can be traumatizing. Just being in the world as somebody who's autistic and has so many sensitivities to everything that it's easy for things to traumatize you.
Exactly. We're more susceptible to things like PTSD.
Mm-hmm. And I had a really abusive stepdad when I was a kid, and I mean, he wasn't like the worst in the world, where like he wasn't like giving me bloody noses, but I mean there was enough abuse going on for it to be very abusive. And for me, being how I am, it was very extreme for me.
Yes.
The yelling was very extreme. The hitting was very extreme. Like, it was all, like, much more extreme for me, I think, than it was for my sister, who's neurotypical, where she has kind of, like, she has bad feelings about him, too, but they're not in the same kind of, coming from the same place as it is for me.
Yes, you can imagine if people are sensory sensitive, then something like someone yelling at you can have kind of a bigger impact. It kind of makes more of a impression on you. And another common thing I hear with autistic women is that that they've been in like abusive relationships or they've been manipulated. So autistic people can be kind of susceptible to manipulation, and people can pick up on these things. They can see that the autistic person is vulnerable, and they'll be kind of targeted by these narcissists or
My
that sort of
husband,
thing.
who I'm divorcing right now, actually told me once. He said when we were in an argument, he said fine, if when we first you really want to know the truth, when we first started dating, I thought that you were dumb and stupid and naive and disposable. Like he just
Wow.
was like he just flat out said it in an argument. Like, I thought you were naive, so I knew that I could take advantage of you because I was
Damn.
very obviously naive.
Well, on to a happier topic. One trait of autism is loving animals. And I'm like the only autistic person I know that isn't into animals. I'm a bit scared by them, which is an
Yeah.
autistic thing, but just way more rare. Most autistic people love animals.
Yeah, I love animals and I really, really love cats. And I know a lot of autistic girls really love cats too. And there's also a lot of autistic people who have animals or different specific types of animals as their special interests. Like some people are really into sharks, and some people are really into different types of insects, even. And some people are really into cats. There's a lot of people who have like theories that Taylor Swift could be on the autism spectrum too, and I do think that. And she is also obsessed with cats, and there's like an interview where she's naming off like every different kind of breed of cat that she can think of, and she thinks of like so many. And there were people in the comments saying like, no neurotypical would think of that many cat breeds.
Yes, another trait is sleep disorders or any kind of like having a hard time falling asleep, waking up throughout the night, and then also one thing with autism is being getting kind of exhausted quicker than other people, and so sometimes we'll end up sleeping for like 12 hours straight. So I have sleep paralysis, which is a fun sleep disorder. But yeah, it's something like 50% of autistics have some kind of sleep disorder, and the most common one I hear is that their mind is racing and they have a hard time getting to sleep.
Yeah, I need to smoke weed to go to sleep.
Yeah. So speaking of which, part of the sort of point of this podcast is to give you guys the juicy insider details about what it's like being autistic. So one sign of autism is liking to smoke a whole bunch of weed. I have a feeling it affects autistic people differently. Whereas for neurotypicals, it seems to just make them want to fall asleep on the couch. For me, I can't fall asleep for another 3 hours after I do it, and it makes me really creative. And yeah, it's just really good for coping with anxiety. It just all the overstimulation, it just kind of helps balance everything out. We both have our medical cards, but yeah, it's a common thing.
It's also a good mask.
Yes, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other fun trait to talk about is sex. So autistic people are more likely to have unconventional sexual fantasies and more common to be hypersexual. So with the sexual fantasies thing, more likely to be into things like BDSM. And then you can imagine for people that have sensory sensitivities, that can affect sex. And then there's also
Sex is a stim.
Yeah. And then there's also the flip side where some autistic people are asexual, or they have a really low sex drive, or their sex drive goes up and down.
Yeah, I feel like mine goes up and down
Yeah.
for like periods of time.
Yeah. Perhaps related to this area, we can talk about anyone that's LGBT is more likely to be autistic, and men with autism tend to have some pronounced feminine traits, and women tend to have pronounced masculine traits. For me, it's not the most striking thing, but for some people, it really sticks out. One classic way it presents that I noticed it shows with us is men that like to have really long hair and women that like to have short hair. I noticed in your Facebook pictures you had a phase where you had short hair, right?
Yeah, I wanted to grow my hair out, but I've also always wanted to have a pixie cut, and so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna do it and get it out of my system because I know it's always gonna be there, like wanting to do it. So yes. I did do it for a while.
Yes, and I've seen autistic women will go completely bald.
The hair can also just be a sensory issue. Like so that's another thing where it's like some people, the hair really bothers them and they just want to get it. They don't like feeling it on their neck. They don't like feeling it touching them. And so they like a short haircut because it gets it out of the way and they don't have to worry about feeling it. And then some of us, I actually do like my hair longer because a lot of us twist our hair. And that's another thing is that playing with your hair is a stem, and I like twisting my hair around and playing with it, and so that's the reason why a lot of us don't want to get it short anymore.
Yes. So basically, autistic people can sometimes they can look kind of androgynous. We'll say that. Mm-hmm. And then the last big sign I'll mention is masking. So this refers to when autistic people act in a certain way to kind of blend in and fit in, but it's like a superficial version of themselves. And it's really kind of natural. You don't always try to mask, but it's kind of a persona that autistic people have naturally built up. And it can really... This is why it can be really crazy to realize you're autistic, because you realize that this way you've been acting isn't your most authentic form of self, and it can be a big journey to unmask.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the traits. And so... The most important thing is that you learn about autism. Like, we've always known ourselves, and had someone told me all this information when I was younger, I would have realized when I was younger. So to keep learning about autism, one person I recommend listening to is Tony Attwood. He's this British clinician who's like the world's one of the world's biggest experts on autism, and he's got tons of videos. I really recommend looking into that. You should type in, look up weird health traits that you have, and then with autism, and see if there's any link. Just as like an obscure example, I had a really rare form of arthritis when I was like 6, and turns out that sort of arthritis is more common in autistics. It's very rare. It's not like most autistics have that, but just if you have some weird, strange condition that you haven't thought much about, try seeing if that relates to autism, and you might be surprised. I'm adding this in because I forgot to mention we have an Unearthing Autism Discord server that you can find in the description. I always wanted there to be a place on the internet to help people realize if they're autistic by discussing traits and all that, and some internet communities can be weird about that. So we have a whole little section on our Discord server about discussing our traits. And so, you can join our Discord server by clicking the link in the description. You should ask your friends, especially autistic friends. And so one sign of autism is if all your friends are neurodivergent. It's like, I noticed before I realized I was autistic that all my friends had ADHD. And why do I keep dating these women with bipolar? And autistic people tend to attract other autistic people. Mm-hmm.
I think we all understand each other better.
Yeah. And so the general kind of progression of the understanding that for me is that first you realize that you are autistic. You start seeing the traits in yourself. Then you start seeing it in your family members, because as I mentioned, autism doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from your genes. So it's usually one of your parents are autistic, and it's even common for both of your parents to be autistic, because as we said, autistics attract other autistics. I'm sure my mom and dad attracted each other in some part because they were autistic. Mm-hmm. And both your parents are autistic, right?
Yeah, my dad was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum when he was 12, and then my mom is like just now learning a lot about autism from me presenting it to her, and she also has a couple of friends who are autistic that she's been starting to talk to about it more, and so now she's also coming to the realization that she thinks she's autistic too.
Yeah, so first you realize you have the traits, you realize your family has the traits.
And another thing that she mentioned too was that with her probably being autistic and having a lot of these traits, for me being a young child and her being my mom, and it's the first time she's ever been a mom, she had no experience of what it was like to have a neurotypical child or what even these traits were. So when I started showing traits when I was a kid, like the finger thing, for example, like she would notice these things, or my stomach sensitivities, like even just like as a very small baby, when I first switched from breastfeeding to formula, it was very hard for her to find a formula for me that wasn't going to upset my stomach, because everything upset my stomach and everything upsets her stomach. But she just thought, oh, that's just like, it's a normal thing. Like that happened to me, that's happening with her. But she didn't realize that all those things were autism.
My mom too, she's like, oh, you need the tags cut off your shirt? Oh, I did that too, that's normal.
Yeah, everybody does that.
Yeah, so you notice it in yourself, your family, and then in your friends, maybe your loved ones. And then lastly, you notice it in some famous people that you maybe admire. So my big special interest that my other YouTube channel is about is Scriabin. I have a video about how Scriabin was probably autistic. Another big one, a famous person that I really relate to is Fred Rogers. Huh. So Fred Rogers, like from Mr. Rogers. Yeah. It's highly speculated that he was autistic. So he has one autistic trait is having a strange voice, like a scratchy voice. That's like a big tell. And so, yeah, he's got the weird kind of scratchy autistic voice. He is a great jazz pianist and composer.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And he's great with children. He was bullied as a kid, so being bullied as a child is a big autistic trait. And he was asked on national television if he was gay. So sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, autistic people can sometimes there'll be a guy who has kind of the gay voice, but they won't be gay. So yeah.
Yeah, my dad has always like considered himself like metrosexual, and he's described that as like he seems like he's gay, but he's not gay.
Yeah. So our next episode will be all about what to do if you think you're autistic. The kind of pros and cons with diagnosis. Me and Morgan are self-diagnosed, and we have a whole podcast, and we're generally very accepted in the community. And so yeah, we'll talk all about that. Good stuff.
Yep.